All right, they're now recording. So this is the general kickoff for the district carbon neutrality strategy on Monday, September 21st at 11. Kate, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Jen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Johnson. I lead the Green Building and Climate team here at the Department of Energy and Environment. We're so glad you could join us this Monday morning, although we do acknowledge that we would love to see you all in person. We are truly living in some extraordinary times, and so I think it is extremely timely that we're kicking off these conversations about our carbon neutrality strategy. Between COVID-19 and the climate crisis, which we have unfortunately been seeing just how real it is this summer between the heat waves and historic rain events here in DC and the catastrophic wildfires we've seen out west. We also recognize that both COVID-19 and climate change are disproportionately impacting communities of color and those with the least resources, both here in DC and across the country. So we are excited to be kicking off these conversations today, and we have some folks we want to acknowledge who got us this far, starting with our technical team, some of which you'll hear from this morning. So the technical work on the strategy has been led by the team at Integral, Nelson Nygaard, the Institute for Market Transformation, Waste Zero, and Capital Sustainability. So quite a robust team. And we also want to thank the folks at Empower DC, Solar United Neighbors, and the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, who invited us to join conversations they had with community members throughout the spring and summer that have really shaped the conversations we're going to be having over the next few weeks, and also our commitment to advancing racial equity through this strategy. And then finally, we have a lot of agencies that we work very closely with on all things related to climate. So thank you to DDOT, the Department of Public Works, the Department of General Services, the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, and more that I am probably forgetting to list that have provided input so far. So just going to the agenda for today, go to the next slide, Jen. What we're going to try to cover very quickly in the next hour or so, but leaving plenty of time for questions, is why do we care about carbon? Why do we care about it now? What is carbon neutrality? What does it look like? So what are our priorities for 2050? And how do we get there? And then finally, what's next? So hopefully you're tuning in today, but will join us for additional conversations around the strategy coming up soon. And then, like I said, we'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers. You're also welcome to go ahead and put any of your questions in the chat as we go through the presentation. So I am going to turn it back over to Jen, who is going to lead us through the presentation.
Thanks, Kate. So just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Jen Hatch. I work with Kate at DOEE on our climate team, and I also do our greenhouse gas accounting, so I'm thrilled to be starting to think about the future. So just diving in, why carbon? The district is already feeling the effects of climate change, and we expect that it will only get warmer, wetter, and wilder in the future. We're expecting not only warmer average temperatures, but also longer, hotter, more frequent heat waves. We'll see more frequent and intense rain events like the one we had just 10 days ago, and higher tides as a result of rising sea levels. We know that climate change is fueled by the concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, and so long as we are above net zero emissions as a city, we're contributing to the climate crisis. So knowing that, the district committed to taking responsibility for our contribution to climate change. And Mayor Bowser pledged to make DC carbon neutral and climate resilient by 2050. We know full well, though, that carbon neutrality is a target, but not a vision, and we're working to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. We think that tackling climate change is part and parcel of a broader commitment to uphold the values that we hold in DC, particularly around health, opportunity, prosperity, and equity for all district residents. These values will guide our path toward carbon neutrality. And if recent events have taught us anything, it's the importance of adaptation of resilience, of science-based decision-making, and of course, the urgency of addressing racial inequities that are at the heart of our city's biggest challenges. So we're really working to root the strategy in the community values and priorities here and find the linkages between those goals and a zero carbon future. But before we can make a plan for where we're heading, just a quick snapshot of where we are today. So citywide, the district contributes more than 7.5 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent into the atmosphere every year. And the energy that we use in our buildings to heat, to cool, to power them is the largest driver of those emissions. And that's the place we have the most work to do. Transportation is the next largest sector. That's largely driven, sorry, no pun intended actually, by passenger vehicle emissions, and really those that are privately owned. But it also includes anything driving on the district roads and the electricity that we use to power our metro system, our streetcar, and the electric circulators. Last but not least, waste and wastewater captures both the emissions from disposing of all the waste we generate as a city and from treating our wastewater at Blue Plains. But to keep the focus, 95% of our emissions are from energy use, and therefore most of the strategies to achieve net zero carbon target our usage and where that energy comes from. So if we zoom out on our progress to date, the district's emissions have shrunk 27% since 2006, largely due to our grid moving off of coal-fired power plants. There's still a really long way to go to reach our 2032 and 2050 goals that will have to come from actions that we take within the district. Those of you familiar with our Clean Energy DC plan, that charts our pathway to the 2032 goal, and this work that we're doing now is to see how we get to 2050. We are really lucky, though, that we have a host of other work to build and expand upon, that we're not starting from scratch. So this includes the recently updated Sustainable DC 2.0 plan, Climate Ready DC, and Move DC, which DDOT is also updating over the next year. So that's where we are today. Let's move into our target and define carbon neutrality. So becoming carbon neutral or net zero carbon means that, like balancing a scale, each year the city's emissions produced equal the emissions that we capture locally or that we offset. It means coming out to zero on a balance sheet, and it's an absolute target, not relative to a baseline like our Clean Energy DC goals. Every city has to decide their approach to carbon neutrality, and ours is to reduce as much as possible our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions from within the city. That's from our buildings, our energy supply, transportation, and waste. To start that with efficiency first, and then moving to renewable energy. And then as a last resort, we'll offset any remaining emissions from sources we can't get rid of. So a transportation example that might be helpful is that the first step is that we'd want to move more people and more things using less fuel. That might be shifting more trips to biking, walking, transit, carpooling. Second step would be that the vehicles that are still running would be electric. Third step is that the electricity to charge those vehicles would come from clean and renewable sources, ideally first from local sources, but then from a clean regional grid. And lastly, we'd offset what else we couldn't get rid of. So before we move to the technical modeling, I think one of the most exciting things about this work is to start thinking about what 2050 could look like. So we are trying to take a different approach to climate planning this time around, and that starts with the community's vision for 2050. From the work that we did in Sustainable DC 2.0, and with the recent focus group discussions with Empower DC, DC Solar United Neighbors, and the Fiscal Policy Institute, we've started to pull out these themes from what we've heard from the community about what they want to see. These are just a start. we'll continue to work to hear from residents, but the goal here is really for us to see how a transition to a carbon-free future can help advance the vision that we really want to see. So we've heard a lot about housing, that everyone living here now can still afford to be with us in 2050, but that also that the housing is quality, safe, and affordable. We've understandably heard a lot about health and health equity, so your health outcome isn't determined by your zip code. Around transportation, making sure that we have convenient, reliable, safe options, but really that they serve all neighborhoods and residents with all types of schedules and with all incomes. A lot about how opportunity plays in, how a green economy can benefit all residents, and that jobs, classically green or otherwise, pay fair and livable wages. And finally, making sure that residents are prepared for the impacts of climate change that we know are coming, and they have the tools to live sustainably. So imagine, if you will, we're thinking about our homes in 2050. We've made sure all district residents have a place to call home that's healthy and safe. We've done that because as we've built new homes and renovated existing ones, we've improved the quality of construction to make them more efficient and ultimately more affordable to operate. So our homes are more comfortable and quieter from more insulation, better windows. They're easier and less costly to keep cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Our homes are healthy and safe, especially in the kitchen. We have no on-site pollution from burning fossil fuels. That leaves us with healthier indoor air. And even induction cooktops that don't get hot could reduce the risk of burns and other accidents that I at least seem to have in the kitchen. We'd produce less trash per week, have our homes powered by clean energy, and more. You get the idea, but this is how we're starting to think about how our spaces could actually look and feel different. If we zoom out to our neighborhoods, in 2050, most residents would be able to walk, roll, bike, take transit to do most things. And when you do board a bus or get into a vehicle, it will be quiet, clean, and electric. This means we'll see safe and accessible streets, things that make streets safer for pedestrians and cyclists, like better signals or more crossing time, slower speeds, protected lanes, more space. While outside, we'd be breathing cleaner air with electric cars and buses, fewer idling vehicles, and no fossil fuel use in our buildings. We should be able to breathe easier outside as we enjoy the outdoors. We'd also get more clean energy and cheaper utility bills with more community solar projects where power is shared by multiple customers, and that's in addition to the efficiency that we found at home. And then one more zoom out to the region is one thing that I think could be really exciting is we hope to have faster commute times. That's from a couple of things, both enabling people to live closer to where they work, transit improvements throughout the region, including Metro Rail and Metro Bus, that will make commutes easier, more affordable, and safe, and other workplace flexibilities to telework or commute off-peak so that there's less congestion and more space and time for those who need to travel. So I found it really fun to think about what we'd like to see in 30 years, and I think that's really helpful to imagine first. But now I'll walk through some of our technical findings that our illustrious consulting team has helped us get to. Oops. Unless I skip past it. There we go. We modeled 3 pathways. The gray line at the top is the trajectory that we are currently on. This is the scenario where we implement all the pieces of the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act. That mix of policies results in a 63% reduction in annual greenhouse gas emissions from our 2006 starting point by 2050. So it does show us achieving and actually slightly exceeding our clean energy DC goal. The 2 other scenarios are those paths that get us to carbon neutrality. They get us to the same place, which is an 89% reduction over 2006, but the pace at which we see those reductions is really the key. The green line is the more gradual glide path, and the orange line is essentially accelerating all those reductions early on. The accelerated scenario gets us to an 81% reduction by 2032, so it's just a much steeper decline. And one quick note, we've modeled the impact of climate change on the district in all of these scenarios. We know 2050 is going to look different for our climate in DC, and so each of these scenarios takes that into account. Quick note on cumulative emissions. Again, both scenarios get us to the same place, but the difference in how quickly we bend that curve has implications for total emissions from the city. That's really what the Planet Care is about, how much in total we're sending into the atmosphere. So you can see the savings from accelerating action. Studies have suggested that globally, cities like the district need to start taking serious action now and aiming more for like an 80% reduction by 2035. And that's really what the accelerated scenario is meant to model. So I will go through each of the sectors individually, but just a quick snapshot of the importance of continuing to do the work that we've started on the policies that we're implementing now, and also what's left to tackle. Similarly, I'll talk about these further as we go, but as a planning tool, our goal is really to identify some milestones to guide our path forward. Some of these you might recognize from earlier plans like Clean Energy DC. Some others, like heat and hot water systems, we worked backwards from where we need to be in 2050 based on the expected lifespan of those systems. So ultimately, we're working toward a list of milestones and leading indicators so we have guideposts to know whether or not we're on track. So just diving into some of the sectors, we'll start with buildings and energy. Essentially, in order to achieve carbon neutrality, the district needs to eliminate or significantly curtail the use of fossil fuels for energy consumption. That means we have to find alternative ways to heat our buildings and power our vehicles, as we also rapidly expand renewable energy to generate cleaner electricity. So to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, all buildings, new and existing, will need to be highly energy efficient and reliant solely on renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. So on the building energy demand side, again, this is 73% of the district's emissions. The largest total reductions will come from this sector. We extended and expanded upon our Clean Energy DC model to look to 2050 and adjusted the two neutrality scenarios to look at reductions from new building codes and the interplay with our building energy performance standard, which targets the performance of existing buildings. We looked at the significant savings from strategies that address fossil fuel use directly in buildings, and also building grid integration. For a sense of the transformation that we'll need to see, this chart shows us where our emissions will be in 2050 if we follow the path that we're on. And these are using the many building types that we expanded upon from Clean Energy DC. This is where we need to be in 2050. And I think, to me, that really illustrates both the magnitude of the efficiency work and the fuel switching that is ahead. On the building side, we've got to get to net zero new construction by 2026 because each new building that goes up today is locking us into emissions for the future. And for existing buildings, we'll need to dramatically improve their efficiency and shift to all electric by 2050. So these are just some examples of the targets that we've had so far. And in terms of strategies to get there, this is going to be really the topic of conversation as we dive into the focused discussions, but here are some ideas that we've had from other cities, from Clean Energy DC itself, and this is really where we'd like to focus our conversations in the coming weeks and months. On the building energy supply side, those of you who are super familiar with the Clean Energy DC Act, you'll know that our renewable energy portfolio standard is included in that. And so there are a relatively limited number of options that we modeled in addition. The biggest opportunity continues to be power purchase agreements for standard offer service, which was recommended in Clean Energy DC. And we did some modeling around other local generations, like turning food waste into gas and capturing thermal energy from our waste and sewer system. So again, as we move to 100% renewable electricity, we also need to push the grid to get cleaner. We are pretty beholden to that grid, and we'll need to make changes in the supply for on-site energy in buildings for heating and cooking. Again, we'll talk about these more in focused discussions as we go, but just a few examples of possible ways to get started. Goodness. Seems like we have missed a slide. So as I figure that out, I will just talk through the transportation stuff. Transportation is the next sector. For us, that's 22% of our emissions. Really, the approach in our transportation sector is to start with shifting more trips to transit, to biking, to walking, and then moving towards vehicle electrification. That was really informed both by the modeling, but also by the Clean Energy DC, the MOVE DC. I'm not giving due credit. The MOVE DC plan, and as well as our own sustainable DC goals around shifting commute trips. Let me reshare. There we go. Thank you for bearing with me. We are all learning something new in this new virtual world, it seems. So here's the impact of shifting trips to more active and public transportation, and then followed by electrification. So we really like that because it solves both our congestion and our carbon goals together. Some goals, again, we're working with the goals that we had established in MOVE DC and Sustainable DC, but also looking at the lifespan of the vehicles on our roads. We're really looking at how many vehicle miles traveled are driving on district roads, and we'll be looking at the percent of those that are electric as we, thanks, Caroline, as we move forward. Some strategies for transportation, it will be looking at a number of things, how we can improve transit to increase ridership, also shifting trips to other modes, all the way through the way we manage our roads and parking in the city, in addition to electrification. I'm getting a quick note that maybe my screen isn't showing up. Caroline, can you give me a thumbs up if I'm on the right track? Okay, great. Thank you. And again, we will have much in-depth conversation about some strategies we might employ, and that conversation is coming up on Thursday. Finally, waste. For those who are particularly familiar with Clean Energy DC, you'll see that this is a new sector for us, and really this follows the waste hierarchy of reducing how much waste we generate in the first place, then trying as much as we can to reuse, repurpose, recycle that, and finally disposal at the end. Excuse me. It looks like a relatively small share of our emissions, and that's because it really is just accounted for in disposal. We know that's not telling the whole picture of waste, and so we want to be sure to think about the life cycle emissions, the total carbon price tag that goes with the materials that we use and dispose of. And we think this strategy is an opportunity to start thinking about those, even if they don't show up in the accounting right now. So some key areas to think about in the waste sector, we'll focus on some of our biggest sources, which comes from our commercial sector. We'll also talk a lot about different material types, as each, particularly organic materials, have a much higher carbon price tag when you send them to landfill. And then again, we'll come back to life cycle emissions. This is because diversion from landfill and incineration is really important, but we also have goals around building a circular economy. And the modeling shows us that really source reduction, particularly of organic materials, could yield many more savings than disposal or even recycling alone. Again, a lot of these metrics echo what we've seen in Sustainable DC, but we have some opportunity to take a look at those and also make recommendations even around life cycle and source policies. And the conversation will continue. So just a quick note on what's left. If you've been following the modeling, you'll know that we didn't get to zero. And so there is a role for offsets in our plan, even if we do everything we've just walked through. Why is that? Why do we have about 1 million metric tons left per year in 2050 to deal with? A couple of big reasons. One is that we assume not every building and not every vehicle will be 100% electric by then. We also don't assume that all of our electricity will be renewable. Even though we will be purchasing through our renewable portfolio standard enough renewable electricity to meet the city's annual demand, to borrow the phrasing from a recent Google project, the reason this is really important is that we understand that we will still be using electricity at times when the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, and there isn't enough in our batteries. And so at those times, we will be running off a grid that is still running on coal and gas power plants. So we won't be at 100% carbon-free electricity until our grid gets there, or until we have clean energy available for every hour that we're using it. And also a note that we will still have some waste in 2050. Just a couple notes to circle back at the end. We've been focused really, the technical modeling starts from the carbon standpoint, understandably, but we wanted to circle back to equity and resilience. And again, we're starting with the community's vision for 2050, and knowing what must change in order to get to carbon neutrality, see how we might craft solutions that both solve our carbon and our other challenges. So that's really just getting back to making sure we start with the values here in the middle and look at ways of solving them through this necessitated transition to zero carbon. So just as we evaluate policies based on their potential to reduce carbon, we want to look at the community's equity and resilience criteria as evaluative criteria as well. The goal is really to show how we could improve in each of these areas with policies proposed, but at least as a backstop, make sure that we're not making things any worse. So a final policy roadmap could look like something like this. This is just a really simple example, but basically looking at all of the factors on one plane. Ultimately, the goal is to start to be able to tie all of our work back to these community visions and really illustrate how the work that we're doing advances those community goals and identifying the policy gaps that we need to fill in order to make these true. So that was a lot. Thanks for bearing with us. We know that there's a lot of conversation that we want to have coming up. So just a couple quick next steps. Firstly, that we'll post this recording to our website and the slides so you can refer to them at any time, share them around. The really big highlight is that we want to have a set of discussions on the following topics for buildings and transportation to kick us off, where we're really going to concentrate on the how do we get to carbon neutrality. We kind of know the what needs to be done in order to get us there, and it's the how that we could really use your thoughts and ideas to help us. So registration is open. I encourage everyone to sign up for discussions as you're able. And then We will also, it's not live yet, but we soon will be posting a forum on our website where you could provide additional comments written that you're not able to share in one of the focus groups or with us during today's session. And once that goes live, we'll make sure to send it out to everyone. So with that, thanks again for bearing with me through slight technical difficulties and quite a lot of information. We will open up for question and answer now. And if we don't get to your question, we will follow up. You can also reach us at these emails. So I'll just leave them there for a little bit in case you want to copy them down. And I will let Kate open up our Q&A.
Sure. And while folks are typing their questions into the chat, we'll go ahead and tackle some of the questions that came up throughout the presentation. I'm going to attempt to group them by sector, although some of them are very cross-cutting. So thank you for the good questions. Jen, I think the first question we got is a good one for you. It was about offsets. And I think it was a statement and a question, which is totally fine. But it was the offsets must be done with the geographical boundaries with the district, not that we can pollute here in DC and then claim offsets far away. So can you talk a little bit about how we're approaching offsets?
Great, thanks. Love offsets. So I'll start with saying that we're seeking input on criteria that we should be looking at for what those offsets should look like, and that we should apply to offsets before we start purchasing anything. At a minimum, we are committed to follow the principles that have been laid out, that any offsets that we purchase are real, verifiable, and additional, but we welcome any ideas that folks have for bringing them closer to home and where we could see other benefits in addition to the greenhouse gas benefit.
Great, thanks, Jen. I think the next couple questions were related to the building sector. So the first question was, how do we plan to finance energy efficiency in the existing housing stock, in particular noting that there are challenges for existing single family homes and that it can be cost prohibitive for residents. So I think this is a really great example of the conversations we would love to dive into more deeply in the focus groups that Jen shared the schedule, and maybe we can flip back to that. So we invite you to join, especially the existing buildings discussion, where we are going to be focusing on the strategies we need in addition to the building energy performance standard, which we already have on the books for our largest buildings. We know that we need some new strategies and some particular programs focused on our smaller buildings and also single family homes. So that discussion is September 30th at 2 p.m. We'll also be having a housing affordability discussion, which won't be just focused on single family, but more generally, how do we advance energy efficiency and affordability at the same time? So I really hope you can join us for that. The next buildings related question had to do with HFC refrigerants. And for those who aren't familiar, HFCs are a greenhouse gas that is especially potent, although it doesn't live as long as carbon dioxide does in the atmosphere. Unfortunately, we don't have good local data to be able to track greenhouse gas emissions like HFCs that exist in, particularly in refrigerants, so in air conditioning and other equipment. But that doesn't mean that we aren't going to try to address them. So we are interested in hearing your ideas for strategies to address these gases, even if they didn't show up in the pie charts earlier. I will note one important thing to keep in mind about HFCs and refrigerants is that there is international policy that is leading to the phase out of a lot of these chemicals. The United States and Canada are a part of this international agreement. And so while we're interested in strategies that we can take here locally, we know that there's going to be a lot of movement towards greener refrigerants in the future driven by that international policy. So again, invite you to come to any of the buildings related conversations to dig in that more detail. Most likely will come up, I think, in the electrification conversation next Monday from 3 to 4. And then Jen, I think I'll turn it over to you for some of the waste questions.
So we have one question about whether we're looking at conducting a consumption-based greenhouse gas inventory. That's also sometimes a life cycle. It's the equivalent of looking at life cycle emissions. It's a great question. We are looking at it. We've had some back of the envelope numbers done for us. The trick with a consumption-based inventory is the data is really tricky. We usually end up using national data scaled down to DC. So it's helpful in giving us a sense of a rough idea of our carbon footprint when we look at the full scale of our consumption. But it is we haven't cracked the nut on how you might track our progress beyond that because the data locally just doesn't really exist. So I think this is one of those cases where yes, and we might be looking at capturing what is the bigger picture of our carbon emissions if we look at life cycle, but I think we're pretty comfortable in making recommendations that address life cycle emissions without knowing exactly the reduction potential or being able to track that on an annual basis like with the rest of the inventory. Another waste question that I saw is, what's realistic regarding waste recycling? Today we heard reporting on NPR that municipalities have been overwhelmed during the pandemic with cardboard and other recyclables, witnessing during our own collection that DPW has combined collection of recyclables and trash, perhaps due to lack of capacity and resources to process the recyclables. I am not a waste expert, so I will defer those specifics to DPW, but I can say this really does underscore the importance of source reduction and why that is the top of the waste pyramid. And so I think we will see a lot of strategies and thinking and hopefully further discussion about ways that we can target source, like reducing the overall waste stream, and within that particular materials that are really tough to deal with. Either that are really bulky, that have a big carbon price tag, or that we see a lot of in the city.
Great, and then I think we'll go back up to where we started. We got a few more questions about offsets, and so I'm hoping Jen or may also introduce James Parakis, who is on the team from Integral, who knows everything there is to know about our model. Couple questions just clarifying the amount of emissions that remain in 2050. And so if you both can say a little bit more about that.
Sure, I can start just by answering the narrow question of sort of the clarification that the presentation said an 89% reduction, essentially meaning that we need offsets for the remaining 11%. Yes, that is a good point, clarification. So yes, it was an 89% reduction from 2006 levels, meaning that we would need offsets for the remaining 11%. Yes. And then I don't think there was any other specific questions that I saw about that, unless Jen, you saw one.
Nope, I think the next question that I saw is around examples of alternative heating methods in buildings for Kate.
Yeah, and actually I might have James chime in on this one too, just to talk specifically about what we modeled. But one alternative, when we say shifting away from fossil fuels for heating and hot water, we are specifically referring to the on-site combustion of gas or fuel oil. And so there are technologies that allow you to generate heat your water, cook your food without burning fossil fuels in your home or in your business. And so a lot of those have to do with heat pump technology, which we'll be digging into in a lot more detail in our electrification conversation, but there are also renewable sources of what we call thermal or heat energy. And we actually have some examples of this here in DC, tapping into our sewer system, for example, to capture waste heat and use that to provide heating and cooling in our buildings. So the new DC Water headquarters uses this technology, as does the American Geophysical Union, which is one of the first commercial net zero energy project in DC. So those are some examples. And then I don't know, James, if you want to say anything more just about how we accounted for that in the model.
Yeah, I mean, those are all great examples. I would say the only thing that I would add is probably the best alternative, which is no heating system at all, which is sort of an aspirational goal. But if you think about sort of like passive house standards, that's essentially the goal, is to remove the need for active heating systems. And you can achieve that with really good envelope performance. Obviously, that comes at a cost, and we need to talk about how to finance those types of improvements. But there's a considerable amount that you can do with load reduction and heat recovery, particularly in residential buildings and commercial buildings. And then in terms of how that's reflected in the model, Kate articulated that very well. There are a variety of mechanisms. So the primary one is just sort of standard, well, how it's modeled is kind of standard air source heat pumps. But there are a variety of other opportunities. She mentioned a couple of them: geothermal, sewer heat recovery. There's solar hot water heating, which wasn't modeled explicitly, but it's definitely an option. And then all of those can obviously exist kind of at the scale of the individual building, or when you start to get a bit more complexity at the scale of the district, which is also, there are also a lot of opportunities as well. So the way the model was sort of set up, it was very high level, just to try to get an understanding of where these types of strategies would take us to 2050. And then as we start to refine our vision moving forward, we can get much more detailed about specific strategies and what effect they'll have on overall GHG emissions. So great question. I love this question.
Great, and a really great preview of the focused discussions we'll be having around some of the buildings topics, whether it's existing buildings or new construction. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. I think the next question we received was about targets. The question was, do we have any intermediate targets before carbon neutrality, like 75% by X date? The short answer to that is yes. So many of you are hopefully familiar with Sustainable DC 2.0, which Jen mentioned. Sustainable DC, yes, and Caroline is holding up a prop for us. Thank you, Caroline. Dating back to the original Sustainable DC in 2012, we have had a target to reduce emissions 50% below 2006 levels by 2032. And that's really the target that the Clean Energy DC plan puts into action. Provides very step-by-step actions that if we achieve them, we will more than meet that goal. And then we pulled out some milestones in addition along the way to carbon neutrality, but not necessarily another emissions reduction. But Jen, maybe we can pull those slides back up and we can walk through some of that. And I see the follow-up question is it a linear reduction? And the answer to that is no, because the way we modeled it is based on sort of the time it takes for equipment to turn over for us to gradually improve our building stock. So it was definitely not linear, as you can see from those charts. Jen or James, anything you want to add on that?
I don't have too much. I mean, I think you mentioned the key thing, which is that we've incorporated provisions for things like equipment turnover when quite ambitious about this, but when we expect certain policies to take effect and how long they'll last for. And then just in terms of the two overall scenarios, the accelerated scenario and the gradual scenario within those sorts of timeframes. So you say a policy might be implemented in 2025 and it'll take 10 years to run. The gradual scenario sort of incorporates more of a linear model for how we get from 2025 to 2035. The accelerated scenario is more of a sort of logarithmic curve, so it assumes a more rapid adoption earlier on, and then as the years go by, then and gradually reach 100%. And I think this is a very kind of it's an interesting way of modeling something like electrification. So you think about how easy it is, despite I think what some people think, to electrify certain types of buildings, but then how difficult it is to electrify other types of buildings. So this sort of more logarithmic approach, accelerated approach, recognizes that you can make a lot of progress in the first few years, and then it's just going to take longer to really deploy these types of strategies at a larger scale.
And I think we have a follow-up question, which I will see if Jen or James knows off the top of their head, but we may have to follow up. The question is, when do we get to a 75% reduction? I imagine that's from 2006 levels. So we'll test how much Jen and James have memorized the model, but we will get back to you, Matthias, if we don't know off the top of our heads.
I don't know. I mean, it will be in the accelerated scenario, and Jen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it will happen sometime before 2032. But the exact date that we expect to hit that is, I would need to double check on that.
Yeah, well, I wish I could say that I've memorized the model to that granularity, but yes, the key difference, just as James noted, is between the two scenarios. One would happen before 2032 and one would happen somewhere after, but we can circle back on more specific.
And I saw a comment about 75% with 3 question marks. And I would just clarify that that's in the accelerated scenario. So it's possible, but it definitely requires kind of immediate action.
And I guess I would say just one quick note on why we looked at an accelerated scenario. I think many of you are probably familiar with the concept of that came out of the Paris Climate Agreement about trying to keep temperatures globally from warming more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so what C40 Cities, which is an organization that DC is a part of, has challenged its members to do is to look at what would it take for cities to put out a plan that's consistent with the world meeting that target. And what that means is for cities, especially in the developed world like DC, that would mean really accelerated emissions reductions, like Jen was saying, to keep the total cumulative emissions as low as possible in order to hit that target. So that was part of the reason we wanted to look at an accelerated scenario. And I think many cities that are trying to achieve carbon neutrality are looking at, not just how far they can go, but also how fast they can go. And then I think this might actually be a good final question as we approach the top of the hour. Jen, want to know more about the process from here and the additional sessions. So how will they operate and how can people prepare for them and what should they expect?
Perfect. We are trying our best to replicate the look and feel of gathering all together. Virtually, that's really hard to do. We do really envision these being discussions, and I think it will be more about solicitation of feedback than us presenting. I think we are trying to present as much information in these sessions as we can and really do the listening in the second session. So we'll have a series of prompts, which we hope to send out to participants ahead of the sessions themselves, but it will involve for any given session some amount of sharing a vision for 2050. We can share a little bit about what we've heard from the community as part of that, and then some questions around if we know this is where we need to be in 2050, what are the barriers that you see to us getting there? What are some creative ways that we could think about overcoming that. How might we tweak those ideas to implement or design in a way that advances equity and resilience? So it's really us trying to do the listening, and I think the format will look more of like small group discussions facilitated with like a Google brainstorm sheet where people can type and add to other folks' ideas, and we can jump off from there.
And I think please do spread the word about these sessions. If you have colleagues or friends who might be interested in them, it is certainly not required that they join one of the overview sessions ahead of time. We will provide enough of a recap that people can dive into the conversation, but the recordings will be available too. So if they miss this or either the buildings or the transportation overview, they can watch it ahead of time. So please do help us spread the word about those sessions. The more merrier. And I guess I'll ask Caroline, can we double check that we didn't miss any questions in the chat or anyone raising their hand?
We got all of the questions in the chat.
Great. And Jen, I will hand it back to you to close us out.
Great. Before I do that, I think I may have got a few questions to me privately, and I apologize. It's really hard for me to see the chat while I'm also presenting. So if I didn't capture your question, we're saving the chat and I will circle back with you. But one that I just saw is, how much is the potential for carbon capture by increasing the tree cover of DC? And is financing the planting and culture of trees outside DC a cost-effective form of carbon offset? Those are both great questions and ones we'll have to explore. We have so many goals around our tree canopy for so many different reasons. Carbon isn't the driver of those. We have a lot of street trees. We want them for stormwater and urban heat reasons, but the district is just so small with our land area that it might add up to about a 1% offset for our total emissions, and we can definitely want to explore that, but we will need to do more in addition. So lots of brainstorming to come on that, but lots of love for trees. So with that, and again, we'll circle back to anyone that we may have missed. Apologies if we have. We will also do our best to kind of collate an FAQ across the sessions. So if a question doesn't get answered here, we'll hopefully be able to post an answer along with the slides and the recordings that will all come back to our main website, which I can flip us back to. So just wanted to reiterate, thanks again for everyone spending an hour of your time with us this morning, and for helping us think more deeply about how we achieve our climate and equity and resilience goals together. We're really looking forward to more conversation on where we go from here, and hope to see you all in some of the sessions over the next couple of weeks.